Okay, we will start.
We can start?
Yes.
Good.
It's okay.
Thank you. Hello? Can you hear me? Yes? Good. Hi. Okay, so my name is Luis Bonan, and I want to start by asking you guys a question. How many of you have had to fill out a web form where you've been asked to read a distorted sequence of characters or distorted words like these ones on the internet? Good. How many of you hated doing that? Excellent. Okay, I invented that. That thing is called a CAPTCHA, and the reason is there is to make sure that you, the entity filling out the form, are actually a human and not a computer that was written to submit the form millions and millions of times. And the reason it works is because humans, at least non-visually impaired humans, can read these distorted characters, whereas computer programs can't do it as well yet. Now, CAPTCHAs are used all over the internet. And many of the applications, for example, when you try to buy tickets on, for a concert, the reason they're there is to make sure that nobody can write a program that can buy millions of tickets, kind of two at a time. Or whenever you're trying to get an email account, the reason that's there is to prevent somebody from writing a program that can obtain millions of email accounts. And they're used all over the internet. And at some point, I did a little calculation to figure out how many times one of these is typed every day by people around the world. And it turns out that number is about 200 million times a day. So about 200 million times a day, somebody types one of these. Now, when I first heard this number, I was very proud of myself. I thought, look at the impact that my research has had. But then I started feeling bad, because the thing is that each time you type one of these, not only are they very annoying, but also each time you type one of these, you waste about 10 seconds of your time. And if you multiply 10 seconds by 200 million, you get that humanity as a whole is wasting about 500,000 hours every day typing these annoying CAPTCHAs. And it's because of me. So I started feeling bad. And then I started thinking, is there any way in which we can make good use of this time? See, during those 10 seconds while you're typing this, your brain is doing something amazing. Your brain is doing something that computers cannot yet do. So the question is, can we get you to do something useful? And the answer to that was yes, and this is a project that I did after the original CAPTCHA. It's a project called reCAPTCHA, where the idea is that as you're typing these words, not only are you authenticating yourself as a human, but you're also helping us to digitize books. Okay, so let me explain how that works. So there's a lot of projects out there trying to digitize books. For example, Google has one where they're trying to take all of the world's books and put them on the internet. Now, the way the book digitization process works is that you start with a book, a physical book, and then you take a picture of every page of the book. The next step in the process is a photograph of every page of the book. The next step of the process is that the computer needs to be able to decipher all of the words in these pictures. Now, the problem is that for older books where the ink has faded, the computer cannot recognize many of the words. It's about 30% of the words cannot be recognized by the computer. But humans can recognize these. So what we started doing is we started getting all of the words that the computer could not recognize, and we started getting people to read them for us while they type a CAPTCHA on the internet. Okay, so next time you type one of these CAPTCHAs, these words that are there, many times the words that are coming from books that the computer could not digitize or could not recognize, and we're using the things that people enter to help us digitize the books. Now, some of you may be wondering, wait, if the computer does not know what that word is, how do we know whether what you entered was correct? So how can we grade you? And this is why there are now two words as opposed to just one. See, for one of the words, it's a word for which the computer already knew the answer, and we're going to use that word to grade you. And the other word is a brand new word that we just got out of a book, and it's a brand new word, and the computer may not know what it is. And we give people both words. And we don't tell them which one's which, and we just say, please type both. And if they type the correct word for the one for which the computer already knew the answer, we assume that they are human. And we also get some confidence that they typed the other word correctly. And if we repeat this process like 10 different times, and all the times basically people agree on what this new word is, then that word becomes digitized with very high probability. And that's how the whole process works. Now, using this has been very successful. This is a company that was, well, it started out as a university project, as I was a university professor, then it turned into a company, and then this company was sold to Google, and now Google is using it to digitize approximately 100 million words per day, which is the equivalent of about 2 million books a year are all being digitized one word at a time by just having people type these CAPTCHAs on the internet. Now, because we're doing so many different words, and because we're putting two randomly chosen English words right next to each other, funny things can happen. So, for example, we showed this word, which is the word Christians, which by itself, there's nothing wrong with it. But if you put it along with another randomly chosen word, funny things can happen. So, for example, we showed this, which is pretty bad. But you know, this system is used in millions of websites everywhere in the world. The particular website that showed this was something called the Embassy of the Kingdom of God. So that's very bad. Here's another really bad one. A US politician a few years ago, his name was John Edwards. He had a website. This is what we showed in John Edwards. That was very bad. And unfortunately, because one of these words, we don't know what it is. We don't actually know what that word is. The system doesn't know what it is. This is a very difficult to solve problem because we're just showing a word that we don't know what it is. Okay, so let me tell you about, this is just a project that I worked on before. Let me tell you about the project that I'm currently working on. It's a project called Duolingo. How many of you have heard of Duolingo? Okay, good, the majority of you. So Duolingo, it started, I started Duolingo about 5 years ago, or 5 or 6 years ago, and I was in a very fortunate position in my life. I had just sold my second company to Google, which was basically this company that I just talked about digitizing books. And I wanted to work on something that was related to education. I've always, my passion has always been education. I am a university professor. So I wanted to do something related to education. But my views on education are very related to where I'm from. I am from Guatemala. If you don't know where it is, that is where Guatemala is. It's a public service announcement. Now, this is very important. That is not where they keep the prisoners. That's called Guantanamo. It's not the same. So now Guatemala is a very poor country. And a lot of people talk about education as something that brings equality to different social classes. But what I observed was the opposite. Education was something that brought inequality to different social classes, because what seems to happen in practice, especially in poor countries like Guatemala, is that rich people can buy themselves the best education in the world, and because they're so well educated, they continue to being very rich, whereas poor people barely learn how to read and write. And because they barely know how to read and write, they continue being poor. So I always saw education as something that actually brought a distance between the different social classes as opposed to bringing them together. So I wanted to do something that was related to education, but that would give equal access to all different social classes. This is what I wanted to do. Now, education is very general, so I decided to focus on one aspect of education, which is very big everywhere in the world, which is learning a foreign language. It turns out there's 1.2 billion people in the world learning a foreign language. Now, this is a very strange market. There's 1.2 billion people. Of these people, 800 million of them, 2/3 of them, satisfy 3 properties. First, the language they're learning is English. Second, the reason they're learning English is to get a better job, or to get a job. And third, they're of low socioeconomic conditions. Okay, so most people that are trying to learn a foreign language are basically people that are trying to get out of poverty by learning English. Now, ironically, before Duolingo, most of the ways there were to learn a language were very expensive. Either you hired a personal tutor, which was very expensive, or even with software. Most of the ways there were with software were very expensive. For example, in the United States, there was a program called Rosetta Stone. It was about $1,000. In different other countries, there were other similar programs. They all cost hundreds or thousands of dollars. So this was the irony. Most people were trying to learn a language in order to get out of poverty, but it seems like they needed $1,000 in order to get out of poverty, which didn't make any sense. Which is why, about 5 years ago, we launched this. At first, it was a website called Duolingo, where the idea is that it is a completely 100% free way to learn a language. Now, it started as a website, then we launched an app, an iPhone app, then we launched an Android app, and we started launching, then we launched the Windows Phone app, which I guess that was a mistake, but we launched the Windows Phone app. And so and since then, Duolingo has become very popular. Today, Duolingo is the most popular way to learn languages in the world. We have over 200 million users. And there's a lot of interesting statistics. For example, there are more people learning languages on Duolingo in the United States than there are people learning languages in the whole United States public school system. We teach a lot of languages. I mean, we teach English, we teach Spanish, French, we teach Russian. But we also teach smaller languages. For example, we teach Irish. I will confess, I actually did not know that Irish was a language. I thought they spoke English there, which they do, but there is also a language called Irish. Irish is spoken by 92,000 native speakers. It turns out that on Duolingo we have 2 million people learning Irish. So we can actually multiply the number of speakers by a factor of 10 because we have so many people using Duolingo. Now, what I'm proudest of, what makes me the most proud about Duolingo is that really Duolingo is used by people everywhere in the world in all spectrums of the socioeconomic, in all parts of the socioeconomic spectrum. For example, Bill Gates is the richest man in the world, or depends on which day you look, but the richest man in the world uses Duolingo to learn French. Now, at the same time, there are children in public schools in developing countries, like Colombia and Costa Rica and Guatemala. Children in public schools in developing countries are using Duolingo to learn English. So this is the same exact system is being used by both the richest man in the world and by children in public schools in developing countries, which is what makes me the proudest, because basically it means that more money cannot buy you a better system. Basically, the same system is being used by everybody in the spectrum. And this is what I'm very happy about. Now, Duolingo is very popular, and the question is why. And here's just some things that people have said about Duolingo. So, for example, this person said, in the past 2 days, I've learned more from Duolingo than in 4 years of high school. Now, I don't think Duolingo is that good, so I think that says more about high school than about Duolingo. Or there is this other person. That was my mother. Now, why is it that Duolingo is so popular? And probably one of the biggest reasons, well, it's free, that's really big, but there's other reasons. One of the biggest reasons is that we've made Duolingo really feel easy and really feel like you're playing a game when you're using Duolingo. So early on, when we were developing Duolingo, we realized that one of the hardest things about learning a language by yourself, or learning anything by yourself, is keeping yourself motivated. It's very hard to keep yourself motivated because easily you can start going and playing a game or getting on Instagram or getting on Facebook or whatever. So we decided to try to make Duolingo as close to a game as possible. We don't call it a game, but we try to make it as close to a game as possible. So this is what the main screen of Duolingo, actually this is a little old, this is what the main screen of Duolingo on iPhones used to look like. And the idea is that at the beginning, we split up the language into multiple of these circles that we call skills. Each one of them teaches you something. So, for example, there's plurals that teaches you how to pluralize, or there's animals that teaches you all the words for animals. And at the beginning, only one of these is unlocked, and you have to complete it in order to unlock other ones. So we have this unlocking mechanism that makes it very fun. And inside each skill, the way we teach you is we teach you with very short exercises. So instead of having to read all the theory or read all the different grammar rules and everything, we never have you just reading, you're always doing something. So we teach you with very simple little exercises where, for example, you may have to translate, so that, for example, is in Spanish, or you may have to pick the picture that corresponds to the word, or you may have to speak to the app and it tells you whether you said it correctly. And basically at each time you're doing something that you can either get right or wrong. And whenever you get something right, so there's this bar at the top, this green bar at the top. Whenever you get something right, the bar moves to the right. Whenever you get something wrong, the bar moves to the left, so it goes down. And the idea is that at the beginning that bar is empty, and you have to do a bunch of exercises, and whenever you fill up that bar, you're done with the lesson. That's completing one lesson. Now, we've done a lot of experiments to try to make this experience as engaging as possible. And there are a lot of things that you may not know. Even if you use Duolingo, you may not know. So, for example, whenever you start a lesson on Duolingo, one of the things you may not know is that each lesson is actually tailored or made specifically for you. So we actually have recorded, every time that you do anything on Duolingo, we record it. So whenever you get something wrong, whenever you tap anywhere, we record it. And so we know, for everything you've done on Duolingo, we know what words you're good at, what words you're bad at. We know whether you're good at the past tense or whether you're bad at the future tense. We know all of these things. So for each user, whenever you start a lesson, we actually build a lesson that is specifically built for you to learn the most. And we spend a lot of effort on that. And we build a lesson that is made to keep you engaged. So for example, we may give you things that we know you already know, but since it feels good to get things right, we give them to you just so that you feel good about it. Or we may give you things that we know you're going to get wrong anyways, because a game is not fun when you can always win. So we may give you things that we know you're going to get wrong, but we still give them to you because it's good in order to keep you engaged. So we do a lot of different experiments to try to keep you engaged. I was going to show you, there was a different experiment. So, for example, one of the things we are experimenting with right now is, this is one type of lesson is where basically whenever you get something right, the bar moves to the right, and whenever you get something wrong, the bar moves to the left. We're experimenting with a different type of lesson where you can get at most 5 things wrong. And if you get 5 things wrong, you have to start over. We're experimenting with that and trying to see whether that mechanic actually makes it more fun or less fun for people to do it. And every day we run different experiments to try to keep people more engaged with it. Now, when we first launched Duolingo about 5 years ago, I actually didn't know anything about how to teach languages. My full experience for learning languages is I am a native Spanish speaker. I learned English when I was very young, so I don't remember learning English. And also I tried to learn French when I was 15 because I was in love with a girl and I failed. I failed in both cases. So that's my entire experience for learning languages when I started with Duolingo. And my co-founder, Severin Hacker, also had no experience teaching languages. But we knew we wanted to build a language to teach languages, so what we did is we bought about 10 different books that would tell us how to teach languages. And we read all of them. And we started reading more and more books about how to best teach languages. And at some point we found one book that, I don't remember the title, but it was something like The Best Method to Teach a Language. And I read it, and it had a lot of scientific evidence about why this was the best method to teach a language. And we thought, when we found this book, we thought, this is great. Now all we need to do is make an app that follows this method, and this is the best method to teach a language. Unfortunately, at some point we found another book that was also called something like The Best Method to Teach a Language that was completely different than the first one. And so we didn't know what to do, and we got confused. And so what we did, and by the way, we were engineers trying to come up with answers for these things. We didn't care about philosophy. We just wanted to know, for example, should we teach plurals before adjectives? We just wanted to know very simple questions like that. And it seemed that there was no agreement among the scientific community about which one was better. So what we did is we launched the first version of Duolingo with what we could based on the books. And we were fortunate enough that it started getting a lot of traffic, and we started getting a lot of users. And once we had enough users, once we had a few million users, we realized we were in a unique position in that we could actually answer a lot of these questions for ourselves with our own users. So for example, now if we want to know whether we should teach plurals before adjectives, or say adverbs before adjectives, or the other way around, we just run an experiment with our own users. So what we do is for the next 50,000 people that sign up to Duolingo, it takes about 6 hours to get 50,000 new users on Duolingo. So for the next 50,000 users, to half of them at random, we teach them plurals before adjectives, and to the other half, we teach them adjectives before plurals. And then we measure which ones learn better, and which ones stay in Duolingo for longer, and which ones get answers correctly more often, etc. And we can know once and for all, out of those two methods, which one is better. And we do that every single day. So at any point in time, there are about 100 different experiments running on Duolingo like this one. So if 2 different people in this room sign up to Duolingo, there will be something different in the app among the 2 of them. It may be very small, or it may be very big. But the idea is that we are continually experimenting with our users to actually make Duolingo better. So literally every week Duolingo is a little better at teaching you the language than it was last week. And because of this, Duolingo has become very effective. When we started this was not true, but by now it's pretty effective. So for example, the City University of New York did a little study where they found that if somebody uses Duolingo for 34 hours, they learn the equivalent of 1 university semester of a course in the language, which is usually very good because usually 1 semester takes a lot longer than 34 hours if you do the homework. So that's that. Oh, another thing. One thing that we've always known about Duolingo is it has been really good at teaching you how to read and how to write a little bit and also how to listen, but it has never been so good at teaching you how to talk to somebody else. That's always been something that a lot of people have told us. I want to be able to practice conversation. So we started getting a lot of people asking us to do the following, to change Duolingo so that we could pair you up with somebody else who was learning the language, so that you could practice. Or even better, a lot of people have suggested this idea where if you are a Russian learning English, we should pair you up with an English speaker learning Russian, and then maybe the two of you can somehow teach each other the language. A lot of people have requested this idea, and in fact we've tried it, and we have not added it to Duolingo because every time we try it, it does not work. And here's why it does not work. It seems that about 85% of the people do not want to do this, even though they think they want to. Whenever it comes time to actually doing it, the social anxiety that this requires is too high. And people usually do it once and never do it again, because it requires too much social anxiety. And so whenever we've tried to pair people up, it doesn't work very well. There's some small fraction of people who love this and who do use it. But the majority of the people don't do it very well. And this is actually something that we started realizing. There's a small fraction of people who if they're very extroverted or something, it doesn't matter to them to speak in another language where they don't sound very intelligent to other people. And those, by the way, are exactly the people who are best at learning a language. The ones that don't care about sounding stupid, they're the best at learning a language. Turns out I'm very bad at learning languages, and it's because I feel very self-conscious whenever I make a mistake. So because of that, I don't speak very much when I'm learning a language, and that means I don't get a lot of practice, so I never get better. So this is the issue with learning a language. So one of the things that we did, and we launched this relatively recently, maybe about 6 months ago, on iPhone only. It's going to go on Android soon, but on iPhone only, where the idea is that you can practice your conversation. Instead of doing it with another human, you can practice your conversation with the computer, so with a chatbot. So we actually launched a chatbot that you can do that. It is not yet available for Russian speakers learning English, but it will be soon. But we currently have it available for English speakers learning Spanish, English speakers learning French, learning German, and for Spanish speakers learning English. We have this chatbot, and the idea is that you can practice by texting or by speaking into the app and actually having a full conversation. And the reason people love this is because you can practice a conversation and you don't feel anxious, because as far as they know, the computer is not judging them, even though it really is judging them. But it's not actually, they don't feel like that. This is an interesting graph. This is a graph, or this is a map, hopefully you can see it. This is a map of the most commonly learned language, according to Duolingo, in every country in the world. You can see, for example, in the United States, the most commonly learned language is Spanish. In most countries in the world, the most commonly learned language is English. You can see that. But there's some interesting things here. Probably the most interesting one is how in Sweden, the most commonly learned language is Swedish. Which is very strange. And at first we were we had to look at the data again. Are we sure that this is correct? Because this seems very strange. Why is it that people in Sweden are learning Swedish? They should all know Swedish. But it turns out we went and looked, and yes, it is the case that in Sweden the most commonly learned language is Swedish. But what we did not realize, it makes sense in retrospect, we did not realize that these are people who are learning Swedish whose native, whenever you sign up to Duolingo, you get to pick what your native language is. These are people whose native language is Arabic. So in Sweden, the biggest use of Duolingo is actually of refugees, or people who are Arabic speakers who have moved to Sweden who are trying to learn Swedish. That's the biggest, and it makes sense. In Sweden, everybody knows English for some reason. This makes sense. Now, speaking of this, you can see the biggest language, of course, is English. That's the biggest language to learn in the world. You can see it in the map. This makes a lot of sense. And a few years ago, we started getting an email. This is the last project that I'm going to talk about. This is related to Duolingo. A few years ago, we started getting a lot of emails from people learning English on Duolingo that said, thank you so much for teaching me English. It's really helpful. I was never able to afford English classes before. Now I can learn English. Thank you so much. But now I have a problem, and it is that I need to be able to, I need a certificate that shows that I know English. I need to be able to prove to somebody that I know English. For example, my job requires a certificate, or my university needs a certificate, or I need to apply to a university in the United States, and they need a certificate that I can speak English. Could you give me that certificate? So we started getting this email a lot. And what we did is we went and looked at how this English language certification business works. And what we found was really insane. Turns out, and I knew this, but I didn't really know how big the problem is. It turns out $10 billion a year are spent by people certifying that they know English. The way people usually certify that they know English is they usually have to take a standardized test. There's a few of these. For example, there's the TOEFL. You can take the TOEFL. Or there's the IELTS. Or there's the Cambridge English test. There's a lot of these. And you may need to take them for all kinds of reasons. For example, if you want to go to study in the United Kingdom or in the United States, you have to take one of these tests. If you want to get a work visa in Canada or in the United Kingdom or in Australia, you have to take one of these tests. If you work for many multinational corporations, you have to take one of these tests. And all of these tests, they all work very similarly. They cost about $250, each one of them. In order to take them, you have to go to a testing center. There's a few of these testing centers. You've got to go to a testing center. And usually the whole process takes about 8 weeks. So you have to get an appointment to go to the testing center to take the test, and then that takes about 4 weeks, and then there's another 4 weeks where you have to wait for your results. So the whole process takes about 8 weeks. This all sounds very annoying, but it's even worse because the majority of these tests are taken in developing countries. Now, in a developing country, first of all, $250 is 1 month's salary. That's a lot of money. Secondly, the testing centers are not in every city. They're only in certain cities. So people usually have to travel to take a test, and they have to pay 1 month's salary, and they have to wait 8 weeks. So this whole process seemed really ridiculous. So what we decided to do about 2 years ago is we decided to launch our own English test. So we actually launched this called the Duolingo English test. And this is what we're working on right now. We've launched it, and this test has the following properties. First of all, it's way cheaper. So as opposed to $250, this costs $50. Secondly, you don't have to go to a testing center to take the test. You can take it from home in basically your own computer. And third, you don't have to make an appointment, and you get the results within 24 hours. Now, there were 3 things that were difficult, or that we had to do in order to do this. First, we had to create a test. It turns out creating the test was the easiest thing. It's not that hard to make a test to prove that you know English. So we did that. Secondly, the reason you have to go to a testing center to take a test, to take one of these tests, is to prevent cheating. It's to make sure that you are you and not your cousin, and also to make sure that you didn't show up with a phone that can translate everything for you or something like that. So it's in order to prevent cheating. The way we decided to prevent cheating, because we're going to do it with a computer, is we actually turn on the front-facing camera of your computer and also the microphone, and we record you taking the test. So record you taking the test, and then a real human actually watches you take the test. Watches you taking the test to make sure that you are you and also that you're not cheating. And so that was another problem that we had to solve. And then the third problem that and that's the problem we're currently solving, is we need to get this test accepted by many places. So places need to start accepting the test. So for example, institutions, if you apply to a university, it should be the case that the university accepts the test. And so we're working on that. By now, this test is accepted by about 100 US universities. So if you apply to about 100 different universities, they accept the test. And many of them are very well known. So there's, for example, UCLA, Yale, NYU. There's a bunch of very well-known universities that are starting to accept the test. And the hope is that within a couple of years, as many universities are going to accept this test as the TOEFL, and then everybody's going to be able to take this as opposed to the more expensive one. Now, this actually, the last problem was the hardest to solve, which is getting people to accept this test. Because, when we started, we decided to start with US universities accepting our test. What we did is we would go to the US university, to the admissions office, and we would say, hey, this test that we have, it's good for the world. Let me tell you, it's much cheaper. More people in the world are going to be able to take it. They don't have to go to a testing center. It's good for the world. It turns out that was not a good argument. Nobody cared. When we said it's good for the world, nobody cared. So the way we actually ended up getting the universities to accept our test is we realized one thing. When people were taking the test, we were already recording them with a front-facing camera. So we decided that at the end of the test, we would also ask one question that was open-ended that would allow us to record a 90-second video that we included along with your score. So the Duolingo English test not only has a score, but also a 90-second video of you answering a question in English. And universities get that video. And they love that video because it really tells you whether somebody can speak English or not. So let me show you what one of these videos looks like. This is a person that, yeah, this is one of these videos, so hopefully you can hear it. Let's see.
Talk about a funny incident that happened to you. What happened? And who else was there?
I would say, I wouldn't call this an incident, but it's one of my favorite thing when I'm still learning English. Remember when I was like really young, around like 10 years old, I tried to read articles, and I always see the author as anonymous. And I don't quite know what anonymous means, and I thought it's a writer of some sort. So when I increased my reading amount, and I see more stories or essays that's written by this author called Anonymous, and I was wondering who that author is, and I really respect him as an author because like he can do like poetry, he can do novels, he can do scientific essays, and I think that's really impressive. And one day when I was preparing for a vocabulary test, I learned the word anonymous, and that means without a name. So I feel like that's a pretty funny thing that's happened to me while learning English.
So this is the example of a video that whenever you're applying to university, the university gets this video, and whenever we show this video to a university, they love it because it really allows them to see whether the person actually speaks English or not, as opposed to just a score. So, you know, if you say this, so for example, this person has something like an 85% score on the English test. It's very different to know it's 85% versus to actually hear them speak English. And you can tell whether you can understand them or not, and you can even tell a little bit about their personality. And so ever since we started including that with our score, universities have started accepting the test a lot more. Now, I don't know if we're going to succeed with this English test, but if at the very least the TOEFL reduces their price to $50 as opposed to $250, we're going to call it a success. So hopefully that happens. And that is it. That is all I have to say. So if you have any questions, otherwise, thank you. Thank you very much. You have a question?
Give me a microphone. Thank you. My name is Danilo, and I'm a lecturer of one of the courses that this university offers at Coursera. So cheating in online education worries me a lot. And you said that you would turn on the front camera and record the test, but do you think it solves the problem actually? Because someone can be staying behind the computer and help cheating, nonetheless.
Yes.
And do you think this problem is in principle solvable?
I do think it's in principle solvable for some things, and I believe that English testing is one of them. It may not be solvable for everything, and I'll tell you why I believe it is actually solvable with English testing. Because some of the questions that we actually ask require very fast response, and they have to be, we can see whether the person is actually speaking them or not. So even if there's somebody else telling them the answer, it's very hard to, so if I just show you something, like if I show you a picture and tell you what is it, if you actually know English well, you can very quickly say, oh, that's a picture of a flower. But if you don't know English very well, it takes, even if you have somebody helping you, it takes a really long time for them. Even if you have somebody helping you and you have like an earpiece and they have to be telling you and you're not very good at pronouncing it, that allows us to catch it. So in the case of English language testing, I believe this is solvable. I am not sure in other things. Yes. Actually, the person that is in charge of solving this, or solving a lot of this problem, is a guy who is Indian/Russian, and his dad is actually here. His name is Abhishek, so this is hi.
Hello, my name is Emil. I just wanted to ask you a question about like some demo. But it showed us map of well, in each country the language is mostly learned. So I saw a legend that there are Italian and Turkish, and at the same time I couldn't find it on the map. So I was just wondering which countries do learn most Italian.
That's a great question. I don't know if that's just in the legend of actual, if there's actually a tiny country somewhere in the middle of Europe where that's true. But I don't know. That's a great question. I don't know.
Hi, my name is Olga. Please, can you tell us, do you plan any other big product releases apart from the chatbot? Will it be related only to B2C sector or B2B probably for teachers or schools?
Sorry, say that again. I could not quite understand the question.
Are there going to be any other big product launches apart from the chatbot? Is something for schools or teachers as well?
Yes, we are actually working on a bunch of things. So there's definitely something for schools. We launched something called Duolingo for Schools about a year and a half ago that is being used by a lot of schools. But we're gonna, in terms of big product launches that we have a few. One of them is this is called a big product launch because we really should have done it already. But we're going to launch Chinese. We have not taught Chinese so far because it's very hard to teach the characters. There's a lot of them. So we consider that a big product launch. We're going to launch another thing called Duolingo Stories, where the idea is that you're going to be able to practice your language by reading very short, funny stories. So we're launching that. Another thing that we are in this process of launching is something called Duolingo Events, where the idea is people can basically meet up together with other learners of the language in your city. So we're doing that. It's being piloted in a bunch of cities in the United States, but hopefully that's going to go into the whole world. I think we have about 80 cities where people are meeting up together to practice their language. That's another big product launch. Those are the ones that I can think of right now in the next few months.
Hello, my name is Victor. So I have a question for you and for your life. So what's the final target of this project?
What is the final target of this project? Well, you know what we want to do is it would be amazing if anybody who is learning a language is learning through Duolingo. We would like that. But that's not, language is just one thing. We want to do all of education. So one of the things we're working on that we're going to have at some point in the next, maybe 1 year, is we're going to start teaching people how to read and write in their own native language. So I'm talking about either children or illiterate adults. It turns out that there's about 1 billion people in the world that don't know how to read and write. 1 billion adults in the world that don't know how to read and write. We want to start teaching them. Many of them, by the way, have smartphones. Don't ask me how they use the smartphone if they don't know how to read and write, but they have one. The phone company was very good at selling one to them, so they have it. So we want to launch an app that helps teach people how to read and write. And generally, I think just education as a whole, in as much as we can help the educational institutions, that's what we want to do.
So you said that you want to create a content in not only languages but other files application. So are you going to create all the content themselves, like your company, or are you going to create a platform for other people to use?
Yeah, that's a great question. We actually already have this platform, but only for languages. So what many people don't know is that most of our language courses were actually created by volunteers, not by us as a company. So us as a company, we've made the Spanish course for English speakers, the German course for English speakers, and the French course for English speakers. Those are the main ones we made. Then what we did, we started getting a lot of people requesting languages to add. I mean, some of them made a lot of sense because they're big languages. So people were requesting Japanese or Russian. These are big languages. But when they started requesting languages like Esperanto or much smaller languages, we realized that we ourselves could never add all the languages that people want to add. We as a company didn't even know a single person who spoke Esperanto. So we thought, let's just let volunteers add it, because many of the people who asked for the language also said, I'm willing to help you add it. So we created a website called the Duolingo Language Incubator, where the idea is that if you want to help us add a language, you can apply and you can help us make the course. So far we've gotten about 100,000 people apply to help us add languages, and of those we've accepted maybe about 600 of them. And what we do whenever we want to add a new language is, whenever we get enough volunteers that apply to add a new language, we let them in. We say, you are the team that is going to add this language, and now they're in charge of that. And they add it, and in fact, one of the neat things is that the first language that was added by volunteers was actually the course to teach English for Russian speakers. That was the first one that was added maybe about 3.5 years ago, and it was entirely done by volunteers. So we're already doing that now. The question is, are we going to do that for other aspects of education? And probably, but that, it's much harder to do that rather than just for languages. So at some point.
Hello, my name is Julia, and so all we say sounds very lovely, and it's really great that you care about the education of others, but I wanted to ask you, how do you earn money on this project?
Yes, how do we make money? A great question. I'll tell you everything there is to know about how to make money on Duolingo, and I'll tell you even our finances. Duolingo, this year Duolingo is going to spend $26 million running it. That's how much it costs to run Duolingo, $26 million in 1 year. A lot of it goes to salaries of the employees, but also just hosting. I don't know how many users we have simultaneously, but it must be 100,000 simultaneous users. At any point in time, there's 100,000 people learning on Duolingo. Having all the servers for that is very expensive. So it costs $26 million. This year we're gonna spend 26. We're gonna make about 20. So we're still losing money, and hopefully at some point we won't. And where are we going to make our $20 million? Here's where. At the end of some lessons, you get an ad. So at the end of a lesson, you get an ad. Whenever you tap on that ad, we make money. We have enough users that is going to make us a lot of money. That's one place. The other one is the English test. It doesn't cost us $50 to do the English test. It only costs us about $10. So we make $40 on each English test. Now, take into account that the TOEFL, it also costs them only $10 to give that test, but they charge $250. So that's another place where we make money. And then lately we started launching a subscription of people who want to turn off ads. They can subscribe to Duolingo, and it turns off ads. Now, we don't charge for any educational content, so it is always free to learn. But if you really don't like ads, you can do that. Soon we're going to have. So right now the ads are not. They're not very interesting because they're just normal ads. Like when you finish a language at the end, you may get an ad for, like, I don't know, Burger King, something. It just has nothing to do with Duolingo. Soon we're going to start changing. We're going to start doing ads that are really interesting. They're going to be at the end of a lesson. You're going to get an ad, but it will be a small 30-second video ad, but it's in the language you're learning. And people really like that because it's really cool to be able to see that now you can understand the ads. And people not only really like them, they really watch them. So that is hopefully going to help us make more money.
Hi, my name is Lena. I have a question regarding the level of language that you teach. Duolingo is very good at teaching the basics, up to like intermediate level. What about advanced? I think you got questions.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. That's a great question. So. Again, this is one of those things that I now know a lot more than I wish to know before I started Duolingo. So here's the main thing. The best way there is kind of in the world to refer to how well people learn a language is this thing called the Common European Framework of Reference, CEFR. That divides language knowledge into 7 levels. The first level is 0. It means you don't know the language. It's very easy. You don't know the language. Then there's 6 others. There's A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, C2. C2 is basically native level fluency. Okay, so that's really your native level fluency. A1 is you kind of know how to, ask for directions here and there and maybe, read some signs and stuff like that. And it gets like that. The A levels are called beginner levels. The B levels are what's called, it's not intermediate, they're called independent. So A levels are beginner, B levels are called independent, and C levels are called like advanced fluent or something like that. Duolingo is really good at getting you from 0 to B1. And that's where we get you. Now, we're working a lot on trying to get you to B2. And that's where we're going to end. We don't actually want to get you to the C levels. B2 is a very interesting level. There are many people who have B2 levels who, for example, finish college in the United States, and that's their English level is B2. That means they have an accent, and they make some mistakes, but they are fully understandable. Now, they may not be able to understand a lot of jokes, for example, but that's kind of where we want to get people, because that's the most useful. After that it's good, but we feel like the best way to do that, if you really want to get to C2, you probably should move to the country, or really, really that last part is much harder. So what we're working on is getting people towards B2. Yeah.
Hi. Excuse me.
Hi.
Do you think, is it possible to learn not only languages, but also other subjects like mathematics, physics, and so on, in the same way that Duolingo does?
Yeah, I think so. We have experimented a lot with that. Internally, we've never released it, but yeah, I think there are many things that you can learn. I think the exact same Duolingo method is really good at things that require a lot of repetition. Like learning a language, it just requires a lot of repetition. It's not so good for things like philosophy, where, it's more about, it just doesn't require repetition. But I think, learning geography or certain aspects of math just requires some repetition. So I think anything that requires a lot of repetition, I think we can do.
Do you have any plans about it?
We do. Like I said, the first thing is reading and writing, which does require, it is an enormous amount of repetition that is required to learn how to read. It's like hours and hours and hours of just looking at the same letter over and over and over again. So that's the first one. After that, I'm not sure which one we're going to do. I mean, a lot of people in the company are very interested in kind of, elementary math. A lot of people in the company are interested in that. The hard part with math is that most people don't actually want to learn math outside of school. Whereas, languages is very interesting. Languages, a lot of people want to learn it outside of school. Whereas math is, so in order to be really successful at math, we have to integrate a lot with the school system, and that's hard.
I have 2 short questions. What about translating the web? As far as I know, you started with this kind of business model.
We did.
And the second question is about tiny apps, tiny cards. You also have, and you didn't mention it, so...
Yeah. Okay, 2 great questions. So the first question is, what about translating the web? So when we started Duolingo, the idea of Duolingo has always been, we're going to teach you a language for free. Now, like I said, it costs a lot of money to run Duolingo every year, and it keeps going up every year. This year is $26 million. Our estimate for next year is about $40 million is how much it's going to cost Duolingo, so that keeps going up. And at first we thought, okay, the way we're going to keep it free is, instead of showing you ads or instead of charging you, what we're going to do is, for some of the more advanced users, we're going to get them to help us translate content, and we're going to sell that content. It was a really, it's an elegant idea. So for example, and in fact, we made it work. So we had some clients, for example, CNN was one of our clients. They wrote all of their news in English. They gave it to us, and our users, who were Spanish speakers learning English, would translate the CNN news from English into Spanish as part of their practice while they were learning, and then we would send it back to CNN in Spanish, and they would pay us for having done that. It worked. It was good. CNN was our client for about 3 years. And they didn't fire us, which meant that the translation quality was good. But unfortunately, it required a lot of effort to do this well. And we realized at some point that the majority of the company was actually working on translation accuracy as opposed to on education. And we didn't like that. And so that combined with the other thing is translation. I think translation is a dying business in that it's not there yet, but over time, particularly text translation, computers are getting better and better at it. And so I thought, okay, it's not looking good for the long-term future, and it's costing a lot of effort. Let's stop that. And we decided to concentrate on monetizing in ways that made more sense with education, like the English test. That's what happened. Oh, and Tiny Cards. Yeah, Tiny Cards is it's funny. So this is another app that we launched. I didn't talk about it. It's compared to Duolingo, it's very small, but it's pretty large by now. So we have it has about 2 million active users, and it keeps growing. Basically, it's an app that lets you. It's a flashcard app. It lets you memorize whatever you want. So if you want to use it to memorize Pokemons, you can do it. Or if you want to use it to memorize math formulas or whatever, it's there. It's a very small project within the company. It only has 3 people working on it. But you know, what we said is whenever it passes a certain number of daily active users, we're going to start putting more people in there. And so these 3 people are very motivated to make it do that. We just launched on Android. It was only on iOS and web. We just launched on Android last week. So that's that. Yes? Oh, hi.
Hi. I have maybe a strange question. Have you ever thought about launching language courses for people with special needs? For example, in the United States, every year maybe 800,000 people have stroke, and of those 30% have problems with language.
Yeah, and many of them actually do use Duolingo. I don't know how many, but we do hear a lot from people who use Duolingo after a stroke to try to, you know, get language capabilities back. We have thought about this. We also, another thing that so there's that. There's also dyslexia. Duolingo is actually pretty bad for people with dyslexia because we require you to type, and it's not so good. So we have actually thought about that, and we have a couple of people in the company that are very interested in this. We have never done it, but I think it's a really good thing to do. So at some point, but we have people that are interested in it. We're in the very beginning phases of. We have people that are interested in it.
Hi, first, thanks a lot. It's a cool app. Actually.
Thank you.
My question is about lexics. How would you use lexics to give us some different else?
How do you do what?
Yeah, lexics, the words. Because I see the French and the words are different. Because I'm learning French actually with your app, and I'm learning Dutch with your app. And I see that time to time it's changing. So I'm wondering how we choose the words to give us. Because sometimes it's kind of weird. Because I learn the words I never use in my life. Sometimes I'm missing something. So
yeah. There's a lot to say about these words. How do we choose which words to teach you? It really depends on which language you're learning, because we have these volunteers, and sometimes they choose the words, and of course, at the end of the day, the app is a combination of what the volunteers added and what our algorithms have chosen. But if the volunteers haven't added certain words, our algorithms cannot teach them to you. And sometimes the volunteers really add a lot of sentences with certain words, and our algorithms decide that this is the best word to teach you. And sometimes they're just strange. So for example, if you ever learn, the ones that I find very strange are all the Scandinavian languages, because of the way they were built. They were all built by teams of volunteers. And the first one that we built was the Danish language. And we added Danish, and it was fine. But as soon as we added Danish, we started getting a lot of complaints from people from Sweden and Norway that we had Danish, but we didn't have Swedish in Norway. So fine, we decided to add Swedish. And then as soon as we added Swedish, the Norwegians started complaining a lot. And so then we added Norwegian. And then now the Finns are complaining a lot because we don't have Finnish. But what happened is all 3 of these languages, Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish, were developed very, very close to each other. And so a lot of the words, and it was by teams of volunteers who for some reason were very competitive with each other. So a lot of the words that they added were basically insults to the other languages. So they have like these very funny, like, you know, the sentences that you see are like the Norwegian troll is blah blah, like it's just there, and it's blame the volunteers. That's my answer to you.
It's like French is very strange, actually.
French should not be that strange. There's another thing is, a lot of times we try to add words that help us teach other words, even if they may not be that useful. So for example, one of the things, I do know this about French, they decided that very early on they needed to teach something for how certain adjectives work. and very early on they teach the word for rich. And everything is rich. Like at the beginning, it's like the rich woman wants that.
Absolutely.
The rich man does not want that. The rich, and I don't know why they did that, but yeah, they did that.
I'm thinking about the love lexics in French, but it's a big story.
Yeah.
I'll tell afterwards.
Yes?
Hello, I'm Sergey, and I have 2 questions. First of all, I want to thank you for that great app, creating it, because I really like it, and I personally know people that couldn't afford textbooks, but they use your app and they can learn new languages with ease. So my first question is there a possibility of creating something like Duolingo Academic for people who want to learn lexics in business or medicine, for example, so they can train and build their skills in certain areas? I think that would be a great thing to do. And also, the second question, do you think it will be possible to add some cultural context to languages, because you cannot learn language without culture, without some geography? So is there a possibility of inserting that kind of information?
Yes. So the first question is about, can we create kind of courses that are more geared towards certain types of things? We're starting to do that. The first one we're going to do is travel, because it has the biggest desire. So we're going to do actually, it will be another course on Duolingo. So just like you can learn English, there will be another one that's just called English Travel. That's just for travel. We may start doing that like for business and for other stuff. So yes, we do want to start doing that. And then the second one is for culture. We actually made a decision early on that we were not going to teach. This was, I think, the wrong decision, but we made that decision about 5 years ago. We're not going to teach culture. We said we're going to only do languages. Culture is a very difficult topic because it's very easy, particularly in the United States, it's very easy to offend people when you start, when you start saying things that may be fine culturally in other countries. It's just, so we decided we're not going to do that. I think that was the wrong decision. And I think over time we're going to start adding more culture. If you've ever used the chatbot feature, they're starting to do a lot more cultural things. So really start teaching you how certain things about culture. When we launch this other thing called Duolingo Stories, we're going to add even more culture. Where these are going to be a lot of things that are, when you're learning Spanish, they're going to be stories about Spanish-speaking countries. So we do want to do that. Hopefully that will go over well, and hopefully we won't get criticized for cultural stereotypes.
Awesome, thanks.
Hi, my name is Teres. Thank you for the app, it's really great. I wanted to ask one quick thing. You mentioned that you acquire tons of different statistics every day, and you analyze that, and there is this hot topic of machine learning, deep learning and stuff. Can you comment how to use it or where you use it?
Yeah, we use it in a lot of places. So one of the places where we use it is the Duolingo English test. Has used a lot of machine learning to try to so in order to generate the test questions, all of those were basically generated with artificial intelligence. Another place where we use machine learning and artificial intelligence is the chatbot. So in order to be able to understand, so this is a chatbot. So a lot of chatbots, if you ever interact with a chatbot, a lot of them, they say they're a chatbot, but basically they just give you 3 choices. So they say, what would you like to order? And then it's just like choices, a pizza, a hamburger, or a sandwich. Whereas with our chatbot, we say, what would you like to order? And you can type whatever you want. And so we have to understand what you say. Of course, we cannot understand everything you say, but we use machine learning to try to figure out what you said. Another place where we use it is in making the decision of, whenever you start a lesson, making the decision of what exercises to give you, we're using machine learning to train that. So those are 3 places. Yeah, it's everywhere in the company.
Okay guys, one more question. So this one please. Okay. There. The last one.
So the pressure.
Hi, my name is Andrew, and I'm a student in Intercultural Studies here in the university. And so I have a question about dialects. So as a person from Guatemala, you may know that, for example, the Spanish from Spain and from Latin America is kind of different. And so as a person who lived in Argentina for a lot of years, I'm asking you, do you think of incorporating, for example, the Spanish, like the different dialects and the variations of the word, for example,
Yeah, that's a great question about dialects. So far, we have tried to stay away from dialects. So for example, in Spanish, we teach one Spanish, even though there are, I don't know the exact number, but about 25 different countries that speak Spanish, and they definitely have differences. I mean, Argentinian Spanish is very different from Spanish from Spain, which is pretty different from Spanish from Mexico. But we decided to teach just one. And there was a reason for that. And it's just way more scalable for us to do. And you know, when we're teaching you from 0 to B1, so kind of intermediate level, most of it is the same. It starts varying more and more the more you get advanced. But basically, particularly in Spanish, and this is not true for all languages, but particularly in Spanish, if you know one type of Spanish, people will understand you in other places, and vice versa, at least for the beginning parts. So we do want to do some stuff with dialects, but I think we want to do that for more advanced users. I think at first we're okay with more kind of vanilla versions of each language. We get criticized a lot for this. A lot of people really want to learn Spanish from Spain versus what we teach now, which is probably closest to Mexican Spanish is what we teach now. So we do get, English we teach. We get criticized a lot. When we teach English, the flag we use is the United States flag, because we teach American English, not British English. And we have not made that distinction. And at some point, maybe we will make that distinction, but you know, our belief is that it is much easier to scale if you just pick one version and try to teach that. And then eventually start splitting off the dialects. But for now, for example, we're a lot more, you know, if you ask me, I'm a lot more concerned about the fact that we don't teach Chinese rather than the fact that we don't teach, you know, Argentinian Spanish versus Spanish from Spain. I would like to cover all the major languages first and then start getting into dialects. That's kind of my answer for that.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.